On April 24, 1992, abandoning his first asylum claim, Ahmed Mohammad Ajaj flew from New York to Peshawar, Pakistan, using his alias Ibrahim Salameh, from there to Camp Khalden in Afghanistan. Lacking necessary credentials, Ajaj was sent to Saudi Arabia to obtain a letter of recommendation. On May 16, 1992, he flew to Saudi Arabia via United Arab Emirates, where he procured a letter of introduction requesting the leader of the Camp Khalden to provide the bearer with training in the use of weapons and explosives. Ajaj returned to Pakistan via United Arab Emirates, arriving June 14, 1992, and began the bomb building course. On August 31, 1992, using the services of a Pakistani travel agent, Ahmed Ajaj and a man named Ramzi Yousef boarded Pakistan International Airlines Flight 703 in Peshawar, flew to Karachi, Pakistan, then on to Kennedy Airport in New York City, both men flying first class during both legs of the trip, believing they would receive less scrutiny. Ahmed Ajaj and Yousef together had 5 passports and numerous documents supporting the aliases: a Saudi passport showing signs of alteration, an Iraqi passport bought from a Pakistani official, a photo-substituted Swedish passport, a photo-substituted British passport, a Jordanian passport, identification cards, bank records, education records, medical records, and carried WAMI published manuals. On September 1, 1992, both men landed at Kennedy Airport. Ajaj was sent to secondary immigration inspection, where he claimed he was a member of the Swedish press, traveling as Kurum Khan, with an international student identification card and a falsified Swedish passport. It is unknown whether Ajaj was meant to cause a scene as a distraction to let Yousef slip through, or legitimately lost his temper when he shouted to the inspector, "My mother was Swedish. If you don't believe me, check your computer." The passport was legitimate, belonging to a Swedish citizen who attended a training camp in Pakistan and surrendered his identity cards to those who ran the camp. But Ajaj had used simple school paste to plaster his own photograph over the legitimate owner. In Ajaj's luggage, INS Inspector Mark Hosine and Robert Malafanti found a Saudi passport, the altered Jordanian passport, with supporting documents for both a plane ticket and British passport in the name of Mohammed Azan, as well as bomb-making manuals, videos, and other materials on assembled weapons and explosives assembly, letters referencing his attendance at terrorist training camps, anti-American and anti-Israeli materials, instructions on document forgery, and 2 rubber-stamped devices to alter the seal on passports from Saudi Arabia. One of the manuals, written in 1982, 7 years prior, before the group was founded, was entitled Al-Qaeda, the Base, or the Foundation, and was more widely reported after the group came to prominence in 1989. An INS supervisor informed the FBI Terrorist Task Force, which declined to get involved but requested copies of the file. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was notified but was not interested. Yousef was also sent to secondary immigration inspection for lacking a passport and a visa that would allow him entry into the United States. He presented an Iraqi passport he said he bought from a Pakistani official for $100, adding that the passport was fraudulent. Yousef claimed he was fleeing Saddam Hussein and needed asylum. He had been recently beaten by Iraqi soldiers in Kuwait because they thought he was a member of the Kuwaiti guerrilla organization. INS Inspector Martha Morales also found in his possession a boarding pass in the name of Mohammed Azan and an identity card from Al Bayuni Islamic Center in Arizona with Yousef's photo and his name, Kurum Khan, under which Ajaj had traveled into the United States. Yousef had signed the back of the card as Ramzi Ahmed Yousef. Yousef also had checks from Lloyd's Bank of London and an address book listing what Morales later called unusual places in America for someone to visit who had just come from halfway around the world. Fingerprinted and photographed, his passport was confiscated. Morales said Yousef spoke excellent English with a British accent, admitted his name was Ramzi Yousef, and said he was born in the United Arab Emirates in 1967 and was a citizen of Pakistan. Her supervisor overruled Morales' recommendation to detain Yousef on grounds the INS detention center was full, even though Yousef had committed acts of immigration fraud, traveling under 3 different identities and lying to an INS official, and also giving inspectors evidence linking him to Ahmed Ajaj. With intermingled documents on both men in secondary inspection, Yousef was not linked to Ajaj. He made a claim for political asylum and was released in the United States pending a hearing. Meanwhile, Ajaj's terrorist kit, counterfeit entry stamp, and outburst were all decoys intended to deflect INS attention away from Yousef and facilitate Yousef's processing a premeditated plan intended to exploit routine activities of busy INS inspectors. After more than 8 hours of questioning at 5 a.m. on September 2nd, 1992, the INS handed Ajaj to Wackenhut Correction Corporation for incarceration in a converted warehouse in Queens, New York. Ajaj's passport revealed his June 15, 1992 Pakistani entry stamp was counterfeit. Ajaj told authorities he had political asylum, claimed from a prior entry in February of 1992, and was detained pending a hearing. Ajaj later pleaded guilty to use of an altered passport and served 6 months in prison. However, Yousef never appeared for his hearing. Incarcerated from September 2nd, 1992, Ajaj remained in contact with Yousef and other co-conspirators and continued to be involved with the planning of the World Trade Center bombing plot. Ajaj never contacted Yousef directly. Calls were patched through Big Five hamburgers in Dallas, rendering law enforcement deflection more difficult. The calls were not translated until long after the World Trade Center bombing. Beginning on December 4th, 1992, Yousef placed a series of calls to Ajaj's lawyer in New York and to Ajaj's friend in Texas. Later the same day, a call from Ajaj was transferred to Yousef, permitting the two to speak directly. Ajaj later would live in Houston, Texas. In the conversation, Ajaj immediately brought up the terrorist kit, informing Yousef that the court had ordered the government to return Ajaj's belongings. When Yousef asked if he could take possession of Ajaj's things, Ajaj readily agreed at first, but then said it was not a good idea for Yousef personally to obtain the materials from the government because it might jeopardize Yousef's business, which Ajaj said would be a pity. Ajaj was later released from prison on March 1st, 1993, 3 days after the World Trade Center bombing. He was rearrested in connection with the attacks on March 9, 1993, and his asylum request was denied on April 4, 1993. In jail at the time of the World Trade Center bombing, Ajaj was convicted of having played a role in the early stages of the conspiracy and convicted of 9 counts, sentenced to 240 years, fined $250,000 in order to pay $250 million in restitution. However, who was Ahmed Ajaj? He was actually a small-time crook who was arrested in 1988 for counterfeiting U.S. dollars. Ajaj and 2 other members of his counterfeiting ring ran a printing press in an Arab cemetery outside East Jerusalem, housing their equipment in the same building where religious Muslims washed corpses before burial. When Israeli police raided the cemetery, they arrested Ajaj, who was holding some $100,000 of bogus U.S. currency. Another gang member was carrying an antiquated pistol. Ajaj was convicted of counterfeiting and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. It was during his stay in prison that he was visited by the Israeli Mossad, where they apparently recruited him, claiming that Israeli intelligence sources needed his services to infiltrate Palestinian rings. By the time he was released, after having served just 1 year, Ajaj had seemingly undergone a radical transformation. The Palestinian nationalist, the common crook, had suddenly become a devout Muslim, and soon after he was arrested for smuggling weapons into the West Bank, allegedly for al-Fatah. Although Israelis say Ajaj was expelled to Jordan in April of 1991 as a security risk, Peter Lems, an official for the Palestine Human Rights Center, based in East Jerusalem, told the Village Voice that Ajaj's name does not appear on any known list of Palestinian deportees. Whatever the case, soon after Ajaj left for Israel, he met with Ramzi Yousef in Peshawar, Pakistan, where he reportedly fought with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Both would show up in New York, where they both allegedly befriended members of the radical Muslim clique in the Al Farouk Mosque, along with Sheikh Abdul Rahman, a member of the Gamma Islamiyah. With the Israeli Mossad and the FBI following with close scrutiny members of the Al Farouk cell, the intelligence community, very much like the events of September 11, 2001, had inside knowledge about what was to transpire and even had moles working in some level of the core of the terrorist cells of 1993 and 2001. The question is, what do they know